There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. I'm gonna do an ominous fade out here, but just before I do that, it's pretty important to note that these sons of God were angels, or fallen angels. They were banished into prisons underneath the earth for the sin of corrupting humanity. I don't get it. Did no one think of what they were going to do down there? Because they sure as hell aren't sleeping. Their corruption persists, and since I'm in a biblical mood, the angels, which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness. We don't know what they're doing in those subterranean prisons, though we seem to be doing our best to release them. It's attested pretty much across the board in mythology that fallen gods and monsters have been banished to an underworld, somewhere out of sight. Whether titans or gigantes, they leak the secret corruption of the human by the inhuman. Runaway positive feedback set to poison the earth itself. The old stories are coming true. Inhuman monsters perpetuate now swarming processes of human functionaries corrupted by something like an alien force. They started as small companies, investment adventures, and now they've evolved into monsters and giants. You might well note that this is not in fact a giant. This is a banana. Fair point. But the essence of the giants is more than what meets the eye. They are the fruit of a subterranean evil, a toxic earth. This banana was produced by some Archons, brothers, their law firm, a fallen nephew, psychological warfare, and it implicates governments, spies, terrorism, drug trafficking, and at the end of it, they slapped it with a Christian face. There's a lot of blood under the skin for only $1.50 per kilo. Blood as energy, life force. That's a truth as old as our race. Modern gods require blood as fuel, just as the ancient ones did. 200,000 people died here. Why? For what? Honestly, an evolved form of an ancient evil. Banana Land is for us, so that we can have this. We have become monstrous too. You are what you eat. We too are the output of giant programs, and we don't have any agency to change that. So don't give me some crap about market participation, because this program was running long before we were even born. Programma, something written in advance, like a code, a plan from a future bringing itself about in the present. Now, this program began self-replicating in 1551 and rapidly took over the world. But don't get it mistaken, because this machinic god is not simply an economic program, and it wouldn't be much of a god if it were. The ways of gods are hidden from us. They guide our paths, punish impiety, and generate truth. It's kind of unhinged, I know, to talk about deep states and psyops, and it's also unhinged to talk about subterranean giants with snakes and tentacles for limbs. I get it, but just because it's mythological doesn't mean it isn't true. How's this for conspiracy? Now, nothing I'm about to say is alleged. This is available publicly now on record from this democratic government's website. They don't care if we know, because they know there's nothing we can do about it. This document outlines a plan called PB Success, which was a plan to psyop the American public, the Guatemalan public, and to overthrow the Guatemalan government, which, not that it matters to them, was democratically elected. There are a few functionaries primarily responsible for this plan. The giant United Fruit Company, now Chiquita, same thing, the Dulles brothers, and Edward Bernays. Bernays, if you've heard of him, was hired by the United Fruit Company first to sell bananas, but then his job evolved into propagandizing and committing psychological warfare on their behalf. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, was one of the most powerful men in the country. He was also an executive at Sullivan and Cromwell, a Wall Street law firm where he worked for, you guessed it, United Fruit Company. His brother, Alan Dulles, was also a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell before he became the director of the CIA, and, oh yeah, sat on the board of United Fruit Company. And that's how the machine works. The United Fruit Company was pulling the strings of American foreign policy. Look at the dates here. Now, the Guatemalan government was overthrown in June, and this was the plan secretly published 5 months prior. This document shows how they used psychological warfare on their own people to generate public support for a coup and on the Guatemalans so they'd fear repercussions. This is the goal of mass propaganda, stated explicitly, though in secret. Let's see if you can tell who wrote this. 1. Mass propaganda plays on the subconscious. It deals with principally non-political subjects such as weather, harvests, natural phenomena, omens, customs, etc. Mass propaganda attempts to disrupt people's sense of what is established and certain. It attempts to make the world look shadowy, unsure, and foreboding. 2. Mass propaganda speaks in a variety of manners. It may make a sharp, direct attack. It may deal in veiled allusions. It may be deliberately self-contradictory. It may be outlandish. 3. Mass propaganda must be most closely geared to the moment, to the moods, habits, topics of public interest, and customs prevailing at the time it is put out. For this reason, although themes are assigned to media, below, these themes are only illustrative since research and events may dictate the need for great flexibility. And 4. Rumor plays a major part in mass propaganda. No rumor topics are assigned below since rumors should constitute targets of opportunity. So that's the playbook. That's the code of this program as it was already working in the 1950s. And just so you know, it worked too. So what are the chances their techniques have improved since then? Do you feel like you're a free, democratic subject, or more like a rat running through an open world psych lab? See, mind control begins with information, and not even disinformation necessarily, just too much information than is possible for us to process into some kind of coherence. So a wash of negative information makes the whole world seem subconsciously perilous. And this is important because it doesn't even have to be specifically political, and it doesn't even have to be a coherent message. Even the weather is in on it. Do you see this? I find this really important because I've read a lot of critical theory and ideology critique, and most of the time it's focused on what a message implies. But we see that consent can be engineered just because you feel like there's too much going wrong. So the goal of the program then is to produce an overall amorphous general anxiety about the future and then give you an answer for it. So mass propaganda is the method of the machine, but how does it trickle down? How does it get into your head? Bernays had many industry-connected friends, and so called up someone at the New York Times and got published this fear-mongering story about the communist menace in Guatemala. Real cartoon, by the way. And because it was the New York Times, all he needed really was that one domino. After that, the Chicago Tribune, Time Magazine, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, Atlantic Magazine, and others all followed suit. We read it and believed it. In order to further control the messaging, Bernays invited a whole bunch of editors and journalists on an all-expenses-paid trip organized and planned by the United Fruit Company. So much for due diligence. Afterwards, they all published stories about how the communists were victimizing the poor little United Fruit Company. The journalists who actually called out United Fruit for what they were doing, and I only found one American example, he couldn't get his story published because all the papers were deathly afraid of even looking communist in the 1950s. Free press, right? So here's this. Whatever of social importance is done today, whether in politics, finance, manufacture, agriculture, charity, education, or other fields, must be done with the help of propaganda. Propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government. Glad we cleared that up. So that was the Bernays contribution to Operation PB success. He paved the way for the dullest contribution to the operation, which was, first of all, to remove covertly and without bloodshed, if possible, the menace of the present communist-controlled government of Guatemala, and then to install and sustain, covertly, a pro-US government in Guatemala. Now, I need to stress this in no uncertain terms. There was no communist government in Guatemala. And also, the CIA and State Department both knew full well that there was no communist government in Guatemala. Arbenz, the president, wanted a capitalist economy, and communist parties were banned. Banned. So all the propaganda I've shown you so far was just a Bernays media invention. Now, what Arbenz did, note this, was not ban foreign ownership of land, but just to stop giving tax exemptions to foreign companies. Now, this was a popular policy among Guatemalans, but not among some landowners in the country, particularly one landowner who owned half of the land in the entire country. Well, 42% of it, to be exact. Guess who? Listen, does this sound like a communist? Arbenz ran, he said, to convert Guatemala from a country bound by a predominantly feudal economy into a modern capitalist one. You know, you could say that this was more a bourgeois revolution against feudalism than a communist revolution against capitalism. Here's another declaration of his goals as leader. If the independence and prosperity of our people were incompatible, which for certain they are not, I am sure the great majority of Guatemalans would prefer to be a poor nation, but free, and not a rich colony, but enslaved. There was this one thing that sounds a little communist that Arbenz was going to do, what's known as land reform. Now, was this land reform lining up landlords and shooting them? Nope. The Agrarian Reform Bill expropriated only unused land, right? Nothing was being grown there, it wasn't developed, and they gave this to peasants and then paid the former owners who were not using it, you know who, what they claimed the land was worth on their taxes, plus annual interest on the land for 25 years. This is not communism. The state's not taking ownership of the land. It quite simply means that rural Guatemalans get to make a living from land that was not being used anyway. And the banana giant would still get paid for the farmer's labor for 25 years without taking on any risk. Now, in case you think I'm taking too long or just belaboring the point, I'm sorry, but Arbenz was not a communist. Still, at the time, everybody knew that he was a communist, thanks to the Bernays propaganda machine. Truth was produced. Not that it even matters, because the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State gives us straight up the definition of communism as anything alien to American ideals and which have adversely affected Guatemala as a place for capital investment. So yeah, communist simply means not servile enough to American companies. Bernays, the CIA, and their corporate Archons produced reality. A reality in which Arbenz was a communist because they said so. This is the kind of stuff that Bernays was putting out in America, and America believed it. America believes it to this day, that there's a spiritual cosmic conflict between Christianity and communism, even when the communism isn't real. Now, Bernays didn't even believe this. He wasn't even a Christian. He was Jewish. Our consent was engineered by his giant corporate clients who only sought to continue exploiting labor in the third world, to the point it has now become the truth itself, a poison truth. I'm sure you need to look no further than the comment section of this video to find out that this mind parasite still lives in people's heads 70 years later. Now, this machine, it really came into its own in this hemisphere by the help of these Archons. The CIA director and the Secretary of State were nominally government employees in a democracy, but democracy was not their master. They were Wall Street lawyers at Sullivan and Cromwell, and their experience was in multinational banking and finance during the Roaring '20s. That was the same time the United States went from being a debtor nation to a creditor nation, and New York replaced London as the world's financial capital after about 3 centuries, which means the surplus moved and needed to be invested. Capital to create capital. The Dulleses worked for banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, investing surplus capital overseas in Germany, China, and Latin America. Sullivan and Cromwell, too, is still around. They work for billion-dollar multinationals, mostly overseeing giant mergers, and notably represented BP after their Gulf oil spill. Now, what does experience with international investment banking have to do with spycraft or statecraft? Well, see, that is the question. It is one machine, hidden from view and yet everywhere. One machine, the purpose of which is the frictionless capacity of capital production. It is a control program, and it doesn't draw distinctions between economic control, land control, psychological control, mind control. So it doesn't really make sense for us to draw these distinctions either. So democracy, more or less, is just an annoyance to this machine. It's an inconvenience. And that's because they often disagree on the future that they want. So in this case, as you've probably already guessed, they got rid of Arbenz. He was exiled, and a military dictator friendly to the US took control. And now within 18 months, he had managed to recuperate all but 0.5% of the banana giant's land that had been bought in the Reform Bill. And what followed was a 40-year-long regime of violence in which more than 200,000 people died. Many were kidnapped and murdered by the government, and most of the victims were indigenous peasants murdered with American weapons and the banana-backed military. The details of all this, I can't go through it all. It's just immense, needless violence. But after this small interruption, the alliance of corporations, the wealthy, and the military regained hold on Guatemala, ruling through a series of corrupt regimes whose last concern was improving the lives of their citizens. The cycle of violence began with Operation PB Success, and all for the benefit of what? Some evil spirit, much worse than the darkest deities our religions have dreamed up. And the US government supported this, of course. This is a report from 1984 describing the hell on earth that Guatemala had become. Previous America's Watch reports on Guatemala have discussed the murder of thousands by a military government that maintains its authority by terror. The killing continues. Yet we have attempted to discuss much else of what is going on in Guatemala in this report because the killings there are far from the whole story of the abuse of human rights. The most pervasive and perhaps the most enduring abuses involve the transformation of a nation with rich and varied cultural traditions into a nation of prisoners. Now, at the same time as this report was being written, Reagan had this to say about Guatemala's president.
President Rios Mount and I have just had a useful exchange of ideas on the problems of the region. I know that President Rios Mount is a man of great personal integrity and commitment.
And not only that, Reagan sent the Guatemalan military $10 million of equipment this same year, with which the government killed tens of thousands of people and displaced about 500,000. So lives just become statistics at this scale. He was later convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity. Again, a being that Reagan called, quote,
a man of great personal integrity and commitment.
Like the ancient giants, Chiquita is one face of an old spiritual corruption, one face of a demonic force cast down by God. The giants who are begotten by spirits and flesh, they will call them unclean spirits upon the earth, and the earth shall be their dwelling. So from where I'm sitting, it's sane enough to believe that these are Archons in human form. Archons that serve not people, but a monstrous alien entity. Cursed offspring halfway between something human and something other than human.